Welcome to ECO351, Study Session 6, Political Economies of Trade Policy. Introduction. Our starting point in this study is to examine the reasons why government should not interfere with trade. Then later we will present arguments against free trade. The final section of this study session examines two important trade policies adopted by developing countries and the implication of each on the economy. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the various arguments in favor and against free trade. 2. Outline the patterns of trade policy in developing countries. Free trade. Arguments for free trade. Adam Smith was the first economist to advocate for free trade. His arguments were based on the fact that free trade reduces efficiency loss associated with protection. As shown in the previous chapter, a small country that imposes tariff on imported products will experience both consumption and production loss. If tariffs were removed, such distortions will be removed. Thus, gains from trade can be increased by removing tariff barriers. Another additional gain from free trade involves economies of scale. When a particular sector is protected, it reduces international competition with two outcomes emerging. 1. The protected firms will not improve on the quality of product, thus reducing consumers' utility. Second, the increase in profit enjoyed by the protected firms attract new entrants and hence the industry becomes bigger. However, the scale of production of each firm becomes inefficient because the output that all firms in the industry can produce could be produced by a smaller size of the industry. In other words, protection of products where economies of scale exist will lead to proliferation of firms and reduces efficiency of each firm. But if the industry is not protected against external competition through trade policy instruments, this would discipline the local producers to produce quality products or leave the market for those who could compete strongly. Those who could not compete can diversify resources by looking for where they can strive. Further, protection tends to restrict innovation and technological know-how. Free trade provides entrepreneurs incentives to think, discover new ways to export, or compete with imports. Apart from economic argument in favor of free trade, there are also some political arguments. The political argument for free trade reflects the fact that a political commitment for free trade may be a good idea in practice, even though there may be better policies in principle. Interestingly, these arguments run counter with the economic benefit of tariff. For instance, economists may advocate for imposition of tariff in order to raise revenue for the government. But if government sees that adoption of free trade policy will lead to income redistribution in favor of some politically influential people, free trade will be chosen, even though it may not generate income for the government. In sum, the three arguments in favor of free trade are: first, the cost of deviation from free trade are large. Second, there are other costs incurred in protection. And third, political process can subvert any deviation from free trade. Arguments against free trade. Trade policy instruments are undertaken specifically to raise income for particular interest group. However, The politicians usually argue that trade policy instruments are adopted in the interest of the whole country. Truly, there are some cases, at least theoretically, where trade policy instruments appear to be welfare friendly. The first argument against free trade comes from the terms of trade argument. As shown earlier, when a country's trade policy can affect the world price, imposition of tariff will reduce import price, raise export price, and hence improve terms of trade. If tariff is very small and the tariff imposing country is big in the world market, the terms of trade will outweigh the cost. The terms of trade argument, however, appears not to work for small countries. This is because small countries have very small ability to influence world price of either their import or export, so that the terms of trade is of little practicable importance. For the big countries, it will mean that it uses monopoly power to extract gains from tariff at the expense of other countries. Domestic market failure argument. The domestic market failure argument against free trade posits that producer surplus does not properly measure the cost and benefits. One strong reason for this is that labor used in a sector would otherwise be unemployed or underemployed. The second reason is born out of the existence of effects in the capital labor market that prevents resources from being transferred as rapidly as they would be to sectors that yield high returns, and the possibility of technological spillover from the industries that are new or particularly innovative. These three reasons constitute the domestic market failure. The domestic market failure argument against trade is a particular case of a more general concept known as the theory of second best, which states that a hands-off policy is desirable in any one market only if all other markets are working properly. If they are not, then government intervention that distorts one sector may raise welfare by offsetting the consequence of the market failure everywhere. Consider a case in which the labor market is not functioning well. Government can intervene by subsidizing labor-intensive sector. This will raise employment, but the subsidy would not be desirable for full employment. Of course, the best strategy is to make wages flexible. But in a case where this cannot be achieved, government can intervene through other markets, the second best, to solve the problem. The application of second best theory to economics comes from being based on the argument that the internal functioning is imperfect, and hence government has to intervene using international trade policies, even though international trade does not cause internal malfunctioning. Trade policy in developing countries. Import substitution industrialization. In the 1970s, the developing countries were thinking of how to shift resources from production of unproductive agricultural sector to the production of industrial goods. One method used to do this was to restrict importation of manufactured goods from developed countries. This strategy became popular for many reasons, of which infant industry argument is one. Infant industry argument shows that many developing countries have comparative advantage in the production of manufactured goods, but because the existing industries were competing with well-established manufacturing firms from developed countries, they appear to be less productive. The reason why it will be difficult for domestic manufacturing industry to compete with the ones from abroad is because the former is still new and at the embryonic stage of production. Thus, government should support the industry until they grow strongly enough to compete internationally. Government should do this by restricting the importation of such import competing products temporarily. The infant industry argument for import substitution policy is that first, it is dangerous to protect an industry today whose competitive advantage will feature in the future. Second, protecting the sector is bad unless the protection itself leads to competition. Third, and finally, government intervention is required unless there is market failure, even though it takes time and costly to build giant factories. For instance, if industry returns high income to labor and capital, and this leads to developing such industry, it could be taken up by private investors instead of public intervention. For these reasons, the argument against free trade on the ground of the infant industry is shaky. However, some countries have capitalized on the argument in favor of infant industry argument as compelling reasons for developing their economies. Methods used include the provision of subsidy to manufacturing sector. In developing countries, the basic strategy for industrialization has been to develop industries oriented towards domestic market by using trade restrictions such as tariff and quota to discourage the replacement of imported products by domestic products. This strategy is called import substitution strategy. However, import substitution strategy proved the proponents wrong because it does not yield the predetermined result. The reasons are A. Developing countries and less developing countries lack adequate and relevant skill to build the industry. B. The region lack managerial competence. C. They also lack experience in manufacturing industries. D. The social capital and social organization is very weak. Clearly, these problems are internal and have nothing to do with trade policy. Hence, it should rather be tackled using internal policy rather than trade policy. Export orientation industry. We have discovered that it is wrongly perceived that import restriction can help industries grow. Because this strategy, that is import substitution industrialization, has lost its capacity, it was abandoned and another strategy emerged. Although this new strategy, called export orientation industrialization, has been in vogue since mid-1960s, developing countries from Africa actually began to adopt it in the middle 1980s. The new strategy submits that instead of restricting imports to develop the manufacturing sector, it will be reasonable to focus some industries that have competitive export advantage and develop them. The countries that have developed this strategy to grow were labeled high-performance Asian economies by the World Bank. These countries, the four Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore, later then Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and recently China, are focused on developing manufacturing industries that produce, export, and sell them to affluent developed countries. As a result of this, the growth rate of GDP in China was reported to average 10% in the 1990s. The high-performance Asian economies are also very open to international trade and have become stronger up to today, even when they are faced with financial crises in the late 1990s. They were able to survive it. The lesson from this is that important restrictions is not a tenable policy for growing or diversifying the economy. Rather, the policy of export orientation appears to be beneficial. Nigeria adopted export orientation industrialization in the mid 1980s as against import substitution industrialization of the 1970s. The outcome of the strategy was that it did not only increase export but also contributed economic growth of the period. However, it must be noted that export orientation industrialization is not without flaws. Besides, the high-performance Asian economies have also adopted import substitution industrialization at the beginning of their economic transition. Summary. In this study session, you learn that the trade policy of developing countries is concerned with how to promote industrialization and how to cope with the internal inconsistencies of their economies. Government therefore intervenes through the trade policy on the argument that free trade does not allow infant industries to go. The infant industry argument of free trade policy states that manufactured imports must be restricted until domestic industries grow enough to compete reasonably. This is the end of study session 6. Thanks for listening.